What the... One of the things I like to do when I buy a car is replace the fluids and filters. Of course, that includes an oil change. I went into this fully expecting to change the oil, replace the filter, and drive off. But as the work progressed, the plot thickened. First of all, the oil filter cap was ridiculously tight. I actually needed a breaker bar to remove it. I was afraid the top of the cap was going to break off. That's how hard I had to crank on it. After I removed it, I looked into the oil filter housing and saw a bunch of sludge. It was so thick I could scoop it out with a spoon. The drain plug was still out, so I washed the goop out with some solvent and let it drain out the bottom of the engine. I took a sample of the old oil and poured some of it onto a clean towel to see if there's any metal shavings or debris. The oil is dirty, but it doesn't seem to have any chunks in it. I also noticed the oil filter cap had some sludge in it, so off camera I cleaned that out. Next, I installed the new filter and put in some fresh oil. At this point, I fully expected to start up the engine and drive off into the sunset. But instead, I was greeted with this. That sounds like a collapsed lifter. So I guess it's time to pull apart the top end and check out the valve train. Let's listen to some music while I remove the cam cover. Before I started to disassemble the valve train, I turned the engine to TDC cylinder 1. I used a paint marker to color the timing marks on the timing cover and the harmonic balancer. Off camera, I installed a crankshaft locking pin to keep the engine from turning. Now let's remove the Vanos unit. First, that engine support eyelet needs to come off, and the oil line to the Vanos unit needs to be detached. Before removing the Vanos unit, it first needs to be detached from the camshafts. I had to remove the two metal plugs on the front. Then I had to pull out a couple plastic plugs. Angled needle nose pliers will help with that. And last but not least, I had to remove a couple torque screws. Those are the screws that actually attach the Vanos unit to the cams, and they're reverse thread. That's important to remember. Now I can remove the fasteners that hold the Vanos unit in place and remove it from the engine. Before removing the camshafts, I need to detach the timing chains from them. I put a cam locking tool on the cams at this point because I wanted to mark the chain sprockets to make sure they were reinstalled correctly. I used a straight edge and a paint marker to mark a line flush with the top of the cylinder head. I did that on both sides. Okay, let's take all this stuff apart. I should also mention that I laid the parts out on a table in the order I removed them, so I would know how to reassemble them. Now I can remove the camshafts. I think there's a special tool for holding the camshafts while removing the bolts, but I don't have that tool and I think it's pretty expensive. So I loosened each of the nuts a little bit at a time until they were all loose. I'll be honest, it was pretty tedious. I also laid out the cam bearing caps on the table in the order they were installed in the engine. Then I removed the camshafts and wrapped them in plastic bags to protect them. When I removed the cam carriers, all the lifters fell out. I don't think they were damaged though. I also laid out all the lifters on the table in the order they were installed in the engine. Each individual lifter has had enough time to break in with a particular lobe on the camshaft, so mixing and matching lifters at this point is probably not a good idea. I was shocked by the amount of carbon buildup on the cam carriers. You can see I'm breaking off chunks of it with a screwdriver. After getting the big chunks off with the screwdriver, I scrubbed it with a brush and some diesel fuel. Then I blasted it with brake cleaner. The inside of the cylinder head was in similar condition, so I gave it the same treatment. I used a shop vac to remove the debris because I didn't want it falling down into the oil pan. Oh, and I found a collapsed lifter. It was on the intake side of cylinder 4. I dunked it in oil and tried to pump it back up, but no luck. So I bought a new lifter to replace it. I also noticed the upper timing chain guide was broken, so I bought a new one. I used petroleum jelly to hold the lifters in place so they wouldn't fall out when I reinstall the cam carriers. The petroleum jelly will dissolve in the oil so it won't clog the oil filter or anything. Off camera, I reassembled everything and reinstalled the cam cover. I was eager to start up the engine and enjoy the sound of an engine with no valve ticks. But instead, I was greeted with this. The valve train noise is actually worse. I gave it a moment to build up oil pressure and pump up the lifters, but the valve train noise actually got worse. After a minute or so, it was rattling like a diesel, so I shut it off. That was pretty disappointing. At this point, I wasn't sure what was wrong, but a little voice in the back of my head said the valve train wasn't getting enough oil pressure. Did I drop some debris down into the engine and clog the oil pump pickup? We'll find out in the next episode. See you next time.